Good evening, and thank you very much for joining us in another Rumi Forum Book Talk conversation. We are thrilled to be joined by two important pioneers of peace work and search this evening. Steve Killelea, the author of the book Peace in the Age of Chaos, and Chik Dambak from Johns Hopkins University. The book, as the author himself is going to talk about, is the story of a lifetime commitment to peace on a variety of levels, only one of which is the world-renowned Global Peace Index. So working on aid program in one of the most violent conflict places in the world, Northeast Kivu in the Democratic Republic of Congo, philanthropist and business leader Steve Killelea asked himself, what are the most peaceful nations? Unable to find an answer, he created the world's leading measure of peace, the Global Peace Index, which receives over 16 billion media impressions annually and has become the definitive go-to index for heads of state. Steve then went on to establish world-renowned think tank, the Institute for Economics and Peace. Today, its work is used by organizations such as the World Bank, United Nations, and Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and taught in thousands of university courses and around the world. So with that brief introduction, I literally want to keep it brief and turn to you, Steve. You have much to tell us this evening, please.
Great. Well, thank you for the introduction, Ibrahim. And I can't tell you how good this is to be on this call with Chick. Chick and myself are old mates, so probably going back on, it's not quite 20 years, but certainly 17 years now. And I think when my very first trip to Washington, after conceptualizing the idea of the Global Peace Index, and even before it was done, I had a meeting with Chick. And so we met in a famous bookshop in Washington, and we kicked it off and have been close friends ever since. So it's really good to be on the panel with him. I was just saying earlier on to Ibrahim, it's in the Blue Mosque, would have been in Istanbul about, might have been a decade ago now, and they've just had these quotes from Rumi on the wall, and like one of them is we're all a vessel of love swimming within an ocean of love. And it was just one of the most beautiful expressions, and I still quite often refer to that expression to people whenever I meet. So I think Rumi really was one of the profound sages of the ages. They're like truly a great man. But on a much, much lesser note, I'll come around and sort of talk about my book in the Peace in the Age of Chaos. So I'll probably talk not a long while, 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll pass it over to Chick. And then we'll sort of move into a dialogue where Ibrahim will sort of ask the two of us questions, then eventually over to the audience. So Peace in the Age of Chaos, it's really about a transformational concept to reinvigorate societies. So in many ways, particularly in the Western societies, you can see it particularly in the US, is the fabric of societies starting to shred or decay. And positive peace, I believe, is a transformational concept which can give us the ability to reinvigorate our societies and move them into a much more sustainable process for the 21st century. The book itself covers a number of different angles. The first, it's somewhat autobiographical, but only around the aspects of my life related to peace. So it sort of covers some of the really lessons I've learned working in the developing world regarding peace. It's also an entrepreneurial journey about how do you create a global think tank, because I found a lot of people really did like to hear that entrepreneurial story. And then it incorporates the work from IEP and brings that in, and particularly with a focus on positive peace, which I'll come to. And then also looks at the combination of systems thinking and how systems thinking combined with positive peace is a radical way of being able to review the way societies operate. So look, and Ibrahim's touched on some of it, but just a quick sketch of my background. So I started off as a businessman, created 2 IT companies. First one ended up publicly listed on NASDAQ. The second on the Australian Stock Exchange. I made a lot of money out of that. So from that, I created a family foundation, which worked with the poorest of the poor. And so we did, in working with the poorest of the poor, took us into a lot of conflict zones, near post-war zones, because that is where the poorest of the people are, which also highlights just that relationship between economics and peace. And then so the foundation's done about 220 projects around the world now. It's got about 3.6 million direct beneficiaries out of it, so it's had a substantial impact. Now, let's see, in northeast Kivu in the Congo, which is one of the more violent places in the world, and we're looking at projects for fistula tears there. So it had the highest rate of fistula tears in the world, something like 200,000 women suffering from it. And so I started to think, what is the opposite of all these stressed out nations I'm spending time in? What are the most peaceful nations in the world, and what can we learn from them? So I searched the internet, couldn't find anything. And that's how the Global Peace Index was born. But that creates a very simple and very profound question. Because a simple businessman like myself can be walking through Africa and wonder, what are the most peaceful nations in the world, and it hasn't been done, then how much do we actually know about peace? If you can't measure something, can you truly understand it? If you can't measure it, how do you even know whether your actions are helping you or hindering you in achieving your goals? You simply don't. Now, that was the founding of the Global Peace Index. But what I realised as I looked more and more at it is when we're studying peace, generally we're studying conflict. And peace and conflict aren't the same thing. They're similar. You could maybe even say they're two opposite sides of a coin. But and if you go into the peace and conflict centres, 90% of what they study is conflict or how to stop conflict. And how to stay peaceful is something really quite different. And just to drive it home, and I'll use an analogy. So we went back through to, let's say, the 60s and since. Great breakthroughs in pathology. None of us are going to die of a heart attack young. We're curing cancers. So the study of pathology is really important. But it wasn't until we studied healthy people did we learn what it took to stay healthy and not to get sick. Things like right exercise, correct mental disposition, good diet. And we're not going to learn none of those things through studying someone on their deathbed. And so if we want peace or a resilient peace, we're not going to understand it by knowing how to stop conflict. We have to look at healthy societies. So what we did then was we took the Global Peace Index, then we did a whole lot of statistical analysis. So we've got about 50,000 different data sets, indexes, attitudinal surveys, which we then sort of came back and used statistical analysis to understand the factors which most closely associated with highly peaceful societies. And that we called positive peace. And so once we got those factors, we dropped things which were similar and duplicates and such, and then used further statistical analysis to be able to clump them together to understand what sort of factors were associated with each other. And it fell out into 8 different domains. And those domains we call the 8 pillars of positive peace. And so what's profound about this is it's not my ideas of peace. It's not a moral judgment on peace. It's something which is empirically derived as to what actually creates peace. So now, at that point, you can take these positive peace, we turned it around into an index or a country index. And that became very, very important because what it did then, it gave us the ability to be able to determine the momentum of societies. Were they building the things which are going to make a society peaceful? Or were they building the things which were going to create societies which were less peaceful? So this gave us the ability now to be able to project into the future what the likely state of peace would be. We developed a model around that, which has got a title called Positive Peace Deficit Model. But basically what we did is we were able to take countries where the positive peace was much lower than the actual peacefulness of the countries. And on that basis, we figured that these countries over time would fall in peace. And what we've found with the last iteration of this methodology, that we could predict 9 to 10 largest falls in peace over the last decade, a decade before they occurred. And so as a predictive capability, this is really important. And having that level of predictive capability means you're not having knee-jerk actions 3 months before a conflict breaks out. You've got 5 years to a decade to understand where it'll be to take the right corrective action. But once we've established the Positive Peace Index, we could then also look at how other factors were associated with peace, or the things which created peace. Now, this became fascinating for me, absolutely fascinating. So what we found is that the same factors which create peace, or those pillars of positive peace, the same factors which create a whole lot of other things we think are important. So positive peace is statistically related to higher GDP growth, better measures on well-being and happiness, better performance on ecological measures, better measures on inclusion, and a number of other factors as well. So therefore, in many ways, positive peace could be described as the optimum environment for human potential to flourish. And so we really did have something profound. So we now started to look at that and look at it, let's say, through an economic lens. So countries which are improving in positive peace compared to countries which are deteriorating have 3 times higher GDP growth rates over a lengthy period, 20 to 60 years. These are really profoundly different growth rates. We found that they had twice the level of foreign direct investment. We found that the inflation rates and interest rates were half of what they were, yet they were 7 times less volatile. There were sovereign ratings measured through Moody's and Standard & Poor's and such tended to improve over time, whereas countries which were deteriorating positive peace, their ratings deteriorated over time. We found that their currencies appreciated as well over time compared to countries which are deteriorating in positive peace, where those exchange rates fell. So the economic argument is incredibly important. So on the back of that, we then worked out the cost of violence to the global economy. And it came in at $15 trillion in 2020. Now, that's a conservative estimate because we can only count what we can count. There's a lot of things we don't count. Domestic violence would be one. Now, just think about that. Give you an idea of just how big that figure is. That's 1%. 1%, the cost of violence to the global economy, is the equivalent of all overseas developmental aid in 2020. Now, none of us can imagine a world which is peaceful. I can't. But within our imaginations, all of us can imagine a world which is 10% more peaceful. And that would be the equivalent of $1.5 trillion. Now, $1.5 trillion is the equivalent of adding 3 economies the size of 3 new countries to the world, the size of, let's say, Norway, Ireland, and Switzerland. So we can see there's profoundly large amounts of money caught up in violence. The ability to be able to free that up and release it into the economies is greater than any stimulation packages we can really imagine. And I'll stop in about 1 or 2 minutes. The final thing I want to say is the concept of systems thinking. If we look at the major challenges facing humanity today, they're global in nature: climate change, increasing biodiversity, full use of the fresh water on the planet, and probably underpinning all of them, overpopulation. So unless we have a world which is basically peaceful, we'll never get the levels of trust, cooperation, and inclusiveness necessary to solve those problems. Therefore, peace is a prerequisite for the survival of society as we know it in the 21st century. That's different than any other epoch in human history. In the past, it may have been the domain of the altruistic, but in the 21st century, it's literally in everyone's self-interest. Now, if we come back to those big systemic problems I was talking about, they're all systemic in nature. And when we look at human societies, they work as systems also, but it's really poorly understood. A lot of people talk about systems, but they don't truly understand how profound thinking of societies as systems really is. And if we're ever going to tackle the bigger problems, we're really going to have to start to see human societies as systems and how our systems fit in those broader systems which we're all dependent on. So I'll just give you a really, and this is a little bit philosophical, but just how really different the way systems operate. So if we look at the rise of the empiric science, it was based on the study of physics. And again, it's a bit like the study of pathology, great breakthroughs, like we can all see where science has taken us. And built right deep within our subconscious, this understanding of the physical world as well. And it's based on cause and effect. So basically, you have a cause, it has an effect, but the effect has no influence on the cause. And it's a bit like taking a ball, throwing it into the air and catching it. It'll always come down at the same pace. And so that's the way we think about the way societies operate. Here's a problem. What's the cause? Let's fix the cause, and then the problem will go away. But systems don't work that way. They work very, very differently. And so concept, like because it's just built into our psychology, we'll walk down the street because we understand this physical cause and effect. That's how legs move at a subconscious level. But societies operate differently. So the first thing is the cause and effect are mutually interacting with each other all the time. The effect comes back and hits the cause to try and shape it. Inflation takes off, society changes the interest rates to correct inflation. You get out an outbreak of violence, demonstrations, you get more police deployed to try and fix it. And also, you can't actually really separate a cause and effect. Things work together, interacting with each other. So you think of government, the functioning of government, you think of a free press and you think of corruption. Does corruption affect the government and the free press? Or does free press affect government and corruption? Or does the government affect free press and corruption? They're all changing all the time. Think of two political parties, always changing according to the actions the other one takes. So this concept of linear cause and effect doesn't work. The other thing in this kind of scenario as well, you can take something and break it down into smaller and smaller and smaller parts to understand it. And if we look at our whole education system, it's based on that. And so is empiric science. Then you pull it back together and you understand the whole. But systems don't work that way because the system itself is more than the sum of its parts. Think of your human body. Think of your consciousness. Your consciousness is far more than the sum of your parts. And these are profoundly different ways of thinking about how you run societies. Because what's important is not the event, like let's say the Trump event or the Trump effect. What's important is the relationships and flows, because the relationships and flows bring about the events. And we're seeing other great people in history reflect this. Leo Tolstoy, for example, War and Peace, talked about the march of history and that great men didn't shape history. Rather, great men were shaped by the march of history and could only arise because of the circumstances of their times. So, positive peace, when combined with systems thinking, gives us a blueprint for how we can run societies so they're more meaningful for participants in society, more economically beneficial, far more peaceful, more resilient and more adaptable. And I'll stop there now. So that's a quick, rough view of what's covered in the book, as well as the entrepreneurial story and as well as the story of some of my adventures in the developing world.
Well, thank you very much, Steve, for this story, this truly entrepreneurial story in many ways. So now I turn to Chick, and Chick, why don't you lead us with your questions and further reflections?
Certainly, happy to. It's a real honor to be on this program with you and the Rumi Forum, and of course with my dear friend Steve. And it's been quite an adventure seeing this whole thing move forward. I came into this from a very different angle than Steve did. I'm a product of the 60s and got involved in the anti-war movement on campus in Oklahoma. There are a couple of people on this call who were colleagues of mine in that effort. So Jim and Hank, good to see you here. And I was a Peace Corps volunteer, and that kind of got me connected with the rest of the world and the whole concept of building a more peaceful world. And then more recently ran the National Peace Corps Association and the Alliance for Peace Building, a global network of people and organizations that are dedicated to building a more peaceful world. But when Steve came along, quite frankly, my initial reaction, that of many others, was, what's this entrepreneurial businessman think he's going to teach us about peace? We're the ones that have been studying it and writing the books about it and so on, and teaching the classes. And here comes this guy from the IT world. And but I fortunately was willing to listen. And after just a few minutes of listening, my jaw dropped and said, this guy's onto something. It's a whole fresh, new, vital way of looking at the issues of war and peace. And this whole concept of positive peace, which had been around for a while, but really nobody had done very much with it. The terminology existed, but it really didn't have much practical application. With Steve and the work that he has done has given us the roadmap, as he just indicated, that NGOs, that intergovernmental agencies, the UN and the African Union and so on can apply to the work that they do. And to my way of thinking, one of the most important things that the whole Global Peace Index does is it gives us reason to believe that it can be done. And part of the reason for that is that a lot of people all over the world at every level kind of assumes that violence and warfare is an integral part of human existence, that we've always gone to war and we always will go to war, and there's nothing you can do about it. You just hope that your side prevails. But the fact that the Global Peace Index indicates that about half of the world is living in peace. About half of the countries in the world, based on the analysis from the Global Peace Index, indicates about half of the countries in the world are doing a pretty darn good job. The other half are not doing so well. And sadly, and this is revealed in the Global Peace Index, the divide is becoming greater, just as the divide between wealthy people and impoverished people is growing larger with regard to peace and conflict. You're seeing the peaceful countries becoming more peaceful, the not peaceful countries becoming less peaceful. And I think we need to be aware of that and recognize that we need to be doing something about that. But the good news is that it can be done. If about half of the countries in the world can live in peace, the rest of the countries can too, if they're willing to. And the Global Peace Index, and particularly Steve's new book, Peace in the Age of Chaos, indicates to us a roadmap of how it can be done. I'm not so naive as to think that it can be done quickly. It won't be done quickly. But there is reason to believe it can be done. And if we look at the things that the peaceful countries are doing and doing right, and if the less peaceful countries would learn the lessons from that, and among other things, learn that if you want to become a safe, secure, and prosperous country, try making a more peaceful country, because the correlation between violent conflict and prosperity is all not totally absolute, but it's not far from it. If you want your country to not just survive but thrive, try putting in place systems and policies and programs that enable the society to live more peacefully, for people to find ways to work together to resolve their differences without taking up arms. Then that's the pathway to a better life for everybody, not just a more peaceful society, but a more safe and secure and prosperous society as well. So those are the things that, in my mind, coming from the peace building world and connected with the international networks of people trying to build peace, this is something we didn't have before until Steve came along with his whole new way of looking at it. So speak for myself, but I know for the entire community of peace building, this has been extremely important and extremely valuable in reshaping our thinking and our ways to go forward. So with that as kind of an introduction to my perspective on that, and I think it reflects the perspective of the peace building world. I think, Steve, if you were to address the next conference of the Alliance for Peace Building with the peace building community there, what would you want the main theme of your talk to be? What do you from your perspective? So yeah, you're in touch with all of us, and you see what's going on and what's working and what isn't working. What would you say to the Alliance for Peace Building community if we were to have you as a keynote speaker this fall?
Well, pretty much along the lines of what I've been saying here, Chick. It'd be positive peace as a transformational way of being able to not only create peace, but a thriving society as well. And so, look, I think one of the things is with positive peace is its characteristics of resilience. So if you look at the concept of resilience, societies get hit with shocks, okay? And what's really important is the resilience of the society to be able to absorb the shock. So let's say we look at Haiti, and we go back and we look at the earthquakes in Haiti and the aftermath of that. We saw a society massively smashed. A decade later, they still hadn't recovered. We look at Iceland, and the 2008 global financial crisis. They had one of the worst collapses of any country in the world, basically ended up bankrupt. But it had high levels, but it is the most peaceful nation in the world, and it had high levels of positive peace. So what happened is you got some demonstrations. They weren't violent. You had a new political party outside the parliament, new political party formed. It got power in the next election. And then, in the words of Der Spiegel, some 3 years later, they said that Iceland was the country which, out of the global financial crisis, was the most impacted, but also one of the countries which had one of the most remarkable recoveries in economic history. Not only did they meet their repayments, the International Monetary Fund who bailed them out, they were well ahead of their payments as well, and were paying back ahead of schedule. And so that's an example. So if we start to look countries high in positive peace, you don't have genocides. You don't have genocides in countries which are low in positive peace. You get a lot less levels of political instability, and you get no violent political shocks. And if you come back and you start to look at, let's say, protest movements. So in countries which are high in positive peace, they have less protest movements. They last for a shorter amount of time. They're more moderate in their aims. They're more likely to achieve their aims. And they're far, far, far less violence. And so there are a couple of examples of resilience. So for me, I think for the Alliance for Peace Building crowd, I think that concept of resilience, and also tied up in this is adaptability. And as we move into an uncertain age moving forward, we don't know what the challenges are going to be. Adaptability is going to become much more important than what has in the last, let's say, 50 years. But we can see, because the very structures of possible peace create that environment where societies are more likely to change and adapt to a changing environment as well.
Thank you. One more question, then we'll see what other people have. But you've identified what you consider to be the 8 pillars of peace, of positive peace. And personally, I found that to be tremendously instructive as to how to look at societies where we may be working and trying to bring about peaceful resolution to ongoing conflicts. But and I know in the book and in our discussions, you always talk about it being a full system, and that you can't only address one of those without recognize the impact that other elements of the pillars of peace. But if you were to need to identify the 1 or 2 of those pillars that seem to be the most relevant, now of course it depends on the nature of the conflict, so they're not all the same. But would you identify any one of those 8 as being the single most important one to focus on and make sure you get it right? And if you get it right, then that kind of systematically helps with the others. What are your thoughts on the priorities among the 8 pillars of peace? Or are you just going to say they're all important, which is certainly true, but that's a cop-out. So, which one or ones would you think are the most important to be taken into account?
Well, Chick, I guess I won't take the cop-out option, eh? Otherwise,
I knew you would.
You'll have a go at me. So, okay, yes, you're right. All of the pillars are important. They operate as the system. So, but in some societies, and it'll vary from society to society, some pillars will be more important, will be stronger than other pillars. So one of the ways you can do is look at a particular country or society, look where are the pillars, which are the weakest pillars, and then that's the one you want to focus on. We've found that quite often varies from society to society. Quite often we see a lot of countries will focus on 2 pillars in particular. They'll focus on the business sector, so that's a strong business environment, and high levels of human capital, which in many ways you can see as education, but education is only one aspect. And what we find is when you just focus on those 2 pillars, there's a slightly higher chance of having decreasing levels of peace, only slightly, but it's there. And that shows the error of just trying to pick out the 2 pillars to focus on. But having said all that, I'll come back to one pillar now, which is, I know what you're after, and that's corruption. So corruption is corrosive on everything. And we find that in relationship to peace, there's a tipping point with corruption. It's interesting, you can increase in corruption up to a point, and it only has a minor impact on peace. So you increase the corruption, small impact on peace. You'll get to a tipping point, and once you pass that, small increases in corruption create large drops in peace. And it's a bit like when it gets to the point where, let's say, the police are no longer doing any good. They're now members of the local criminal cartel, for example. So things like that. So the corruption is incredibly important. So if we look at the sustainable, but corruption globally is on the increase. So it's something we really need to think about. And we only know the perceptions of corruption, but globally the perceptions of corruption are that it's on the increase. Now, and that I think is the pillar which really needs addressing. And so if we look at it globally and we look at the 8 pillars, we find that increases in corruption is the only pillar to perform negatively over the last 15 years. The one which nearly performed negatively and only just slightly positive, would you believe, is well-functioning government. And so these 2 things work very intimately and very closely together. final thing I'd say on it is if we come back and we look at corruption and we look at the, let's say, the Sustainable Development Goals, great breakthrough, okay? Truly aspirational in its scope. 117 goals, 169 targets, but only one is related to corruption. And if you can't get corruption, and corruption will eat away at every one of those other 168 targets.
Well, I kind of thought that's where you would end up with the centrality of corruption. As you may know, as I think you do know, I'm deeply involved in the West African country of Mali that is going through just devastating turmoil and violence. And I don't think there's any question that at the core of it is corruption. That there are a number of other issues, but virtually all of the points in the 8 pillars of peace are present, are factors there. But as I talk to people in the country and throughout the country, if they could get the corruption under control, many of the others would start to melt away as well. But I also allow you take the default, the cop out, and say they're all important because they are. And if you only deal with one of them, you're not going to solve the problems. So thank you, Steve. Again, it's a real honor to share this space with you, and I look forward to hearing the questions and comments from our larger audience.
Thank you, Chick, and thank you, Steve. Julia has expressed interest to share a point. Please, Julia.
I think it comes down to something very basic. It comes down to the individual, and then it expands to the community, the country, and the world. The thing is, if the individual has only the goal of making more money, accumulating more wealth, more than is necessary, and at the expense of other people, and try to climb to the top, and this inequality of wealth will create sort of a lot of friction. People who have got too much, just sort of, it's not total, not necessary at all. If your whole goal in life is money, 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 wealth, wealth, the world is not going to have any peace, because if the individual is not having any food on the table, all he or she can think of is, oh, I need to feed myself to be alive. So you really need to change the basic thinking, in your education system, to say that, to look after your, be kind to your fellow human beings, then the world will have peace. If you just think of accumulating more wealth, at the expense of other people or at the expense of other countries, there will never be peace. We really have to change our thinking in our education system, to be kind and, to our fellow human being, share everything. And then there's hope for the world. Otherwise, there will be forever war, because when there's starvation, there will be war. So, it's very basic, but it is a global thing, very basic. But can we do it? Because everybody's goal in the education system is, I'll be the top, I'll be the number one, the top dog, and I get more wealth. So, that's a basic thinking we have to change. Otherwise, there will never be peace. That's my thinking.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that with us, Julia. So it always reminds me of that well-known saying by Mahatma Gandhi, there's enough food to feed the whole of the world, but there's not enough for one greedy person. And sort of it's such a truism, But to some extent, the issue is not the accumulation of wealth. The issue is that everyone's got enough provided so that they've got basic security. And so for me, that's the role of a robust social security net. And so if you get, some countries have got to do it better than others. The US doesn't do it very well at all. So for me, it's not so much that the people shouldn't be accumulating money, it's that you need enough tax take, and then the distribution of that tax take to look after those who are in need, okay? And that gets rid of a whole range of different social ills. But also, when you look into it, it comes back to people's personal motivation. What is the meaning of life? Certainly, a meaning of life, you would think, for it to be personal fulfilling, has to be a lot more than just the accumulation of money. But I do know with a lot of rich people, it's not so much, this is the entrepreneurial type, you know, like your Elon Musks of the world, or your Bill Gates, or your Steve Jobs, those type. It's not so much the money which they're chasing, it's the intellectual challenge. Because in many ways, I loved growing businesses. It's really difficult. You've got no idea. It's really difficult, but it stimulates you. It's competitive, and like a lot of us, we like competitiveness, and competitiveness is good if it's channeled correctly. Obviously, if it's channeled violently, it's highly destructive. But when competitiveness is channeled correctly, it creates innovation. One person leading on to another. It's like great kayak races of the world. They get faster and faster through competing. And so to me, it's a mixture. But like certainly one of the things we need it better. It's more ethics, and I think that's one of the things which Rumi and the things like the Rumi Forum provide. They're an expression of ethics, an ethic compass. So I think a lot of, particularly the Western societies, we've got a breakdown of ethics and moral values in many ways. And so I think there's a lot in that. Yeah.
Thank you, Steve. So I want to step in here with a direct quote from your book. Well, while you were talking about Iceland, I was looking at the top of a page which says adaptability and resilience will be the key. Positive peace is both the measure and the solution for these. And the case of Iceland stands out powerfully about all those key terms that you connected in that sentence. You say the Industrial Revolution went hand in hand with the Enlightenment, where national philosophers like Hume, Voltaire, Adam Smith reshaped the conceptual world in ways just as profound as steam power. Cotton gins and iron rolling mills reshaped economies and society. And you continue by pointing a gap where you say this intellectual revolution is missing in our age. So while we were, as humanity, we have been developed and improved ourselves impressively in one wing, the other wing compared to this industrial revolution story is disproportionately smaller or almost absent. So can you elaborate about this deficit?
Yeah, I think it's sort of obviously it's my own views, but I can't think of a philosopher we've got for the 21st century who really brings it all together. Now, we've got a whole lot of issues, okay, and we've got a whole lot of champions of issues, but we don't have someone who's providing the integrating philosophical framework. So if we look at in the Western societies, Christianity have been the driving philosophical or ethical base for a long, long while. But today, we're looking in the West, it's a bit different in the US, but we'll look at Western Europe in particular. You've got something like 1-2% of the population go to church. Yet, on research we've done and used, you've got 90% of the population in these countries do believe there's some sort of spiritual base. So there's a gap there. And what's needed is some sort of philosophical basis, some philosophical work which can bridge all the different religions, because we move into these multicultural societies. The religions are so vast and different. So what is that philosophical framework which can pull it all together? One which melds with science as we know it, which is in an age of quantum mechanics. The Newtonian physics don't cut it anymore. And one which gives an ethical value which can underpin a society which can grow. I guess that's what I see as the challenge. And so if we look at positive peace, it's not that answer, because it's not the philosophy of the human spirit, but it's certainly a framework which make it more likely for that solution to arise.
Thank you very much, and particularly for specifying what the concept of positive peace, to what role and what extent it can play in this sought after new intellectual angle. So I have a question for Chick. You and people like yourself and Steve have been part of the efforts where peace is from something being too abstract and considered to be too naive, politically maybe even teethless, has turned into a subject, a framework that is supposed to be measured, sought after, and can be built. So this, you are a witness and a laborer of this transformation. So looking at retrospect, what has been achieved, and through the framework of presented in this book, can you just help us project into the future from this point?
Well, I'm probably not very good at projecting the future. Nobody seems to be. But I think we can learn from history. We can learn from the past, and that does, to a certain degree anyway, indicate what we can anticipate going forward. And to my way of thinking, the fact that we have made as much progress as we have as human beings over the decades and the centuries and the millennia. When I first got the job as president of the Alliance for Peace Building, I was back on my college campus and ran into an old friend who has a PhD in history. And I was telling him what I was going to be doing with the Alliance for Peace Building. And he said, "Chick, you naive fool. The world has always been at war. The world will always be at war. And there's nothing you can do about it. You're a fool." Which it didn't surprise me, because I know that's the attitude of a lot of people. But you look at Steve's book and you look at the curve of history, compare life today with what it was 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, in terms of issues of war and peace. It's not a close call. Is there any period in history that we would rather live in than right now with regard to issues of war and peace? As the Global Peace Index indicates, the last decade has not seen more improvement. But if you look at the longer picture, the improvement is absolutely phenomenal. Phenomenal. We are living more in peace now than we ever did before. And thanks to the work that Steve's doing and a lot of other people are doing, there is a growing recognition that there is something that can be done about it, and it's the right thing to do. We all want our countries to be more prosperous. We want to be more prosperous. Try stopping shooting people to get there and cooperating with people to get there. Much more productive, and the more we can come to understand and respect and appreciate that, the sooner we will achieve a much more peaceful society than we have. And the advent of modern technology, where we can communicate, instantly. We got Steve Killelea over there on totally the other side of the world, and here we are just carrying on a conversation with a guy on the other side of the world. I have a good friend who's from Timbuktu. Timbuktu, farthest place in the world. He and I exchange email messages, and then we get on the phone. We can do that now. So the capacity through communication and building mutual respect to build a more peaceful world has never been better than it is right now. At the same time, the capacity for destruction is greater than it ever has been. And I hope that scares the hell out of all of us to say, we could either go down the path of violence and destruction, or we can go down the path of living peaceably with one another. And I don't think that's a close call. I do a fair amount of lecturing around the world, less of it now that I'm getting older, but I almost always start off asking the audience, would you rather live in a world of peace, or a country that's at peace, or a country that's at war? Guess how many hands I've seen go up saying they'd rather live in a country at war? None. And I used to lecture regularly at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and I would ask that question: do you want to live in a country that's at war, or a country that's at peace? Without exception, people want to live in a country at peace. And then I follow up and say, well, then are you willing to make some effort to try to figure out how you get there? And what Steve has done, and what my colleagues in the peace building community and many others has done, is try to figure out, how do we get from where we are to where we want to be? But there is a universal desire to have a more peaceful society to live in. And my question to people is, if that's a universal desire, why not do something about it? Why not join with the colleagues who are trying to achieve that and make a difference, and make the world more peaceful? And that's why the whole peace building community has come together just over the last couple of decades. It didn't exist a few decades ago. The U.S. Institute of Peace didn't exist 40 years ago. I've often made the comment that if when I went to college, I wanted to study peace, I couldn't have done it because there were no college courses in building peace. Over now, I exaggerate a little bit. There were a couple in some tiny institutions, but it virtually didn't exist. Wasn't on the radar screen. Now we have over 200 certified graduate programs in conflict resolution, in building peace. And that's all new. It's all new stuff. But it's happening because there is a growing recognition of the value of, and the desire for, and that we're developing the skills to make the world more peaceful. And but that's why I remain confident. I don't think we'll get there in my lifetime, and we never get to the point of having total universal peace. But most everybody wants to see it be there, and through the work that we're doing, through the work that Steve's doing, we're figuring out how to get it done. And now that we're getting an idea of how to get it done, it's a matter of applying those lessons to what we do at the community level, at the state level, and at the national and international level. So I'm optimistic. I'm confident that we will continue to make progress. There'll be setbacks along the way, of course, but I'm totally confident that the progress is not only possible, but probable.
Which reminds me of a seminary comment where it was being discussed that collecting the data and putting it into a meaningful research argument, one is collecting the dots and the other is connecting the dots. So the peace research community, we can attest, dedicated several decades to collecting those dots, and now has the entire capacity and commitment to connect those. And this book is one great example.
It sure is.
So here's a question from Jim Truxell from Chicago, USA. Steve, in your mind, how important is the strengthening of the cultural components, art, education, ethical foundations, etc., towards establishing peace within and among societies? Is this as important, if not higher, than establishing the economic foundations of a society, or even the ensuring the political fabric of a society?
Well, I'll take a cop-out answer. They're all important, and they're all systemic, and they all feed into each other. So obviously, all societies, the cultural aspects are incredibly important. And so but the cultural aspects in different societies will have different importance depending on the fabric of the society. So if we look at, let's say, in the United States, for example, that concept of multiculturalism is incredibly important. So the culture is, in many ways, has got to be about the integration and bringing them in. If you went back and you went to, let's say, some countries in Africa, the cultural aspect there is more sort of the acceptance of the tribes rather than the multicultural aspect, because cultures are similar. It's just that how do you get the acceptance within the different tribes, which have really been fighting for thousands of years. So in many ways, sort of, they're all important. With the economic framework more important than the cultural aspects, like the arts, for example. But in many ways, the economics is what fuels the arts. So look at the Smithsonian Institutes through New York. I think you've got 6 of them, for example. That came from the produce of capitalism, a sort of a wealthy individual. So a byproduct of wealth. So these things feed in together. But then again, on the other hand, if you haven't got a healthy arts and ethical base, the capitalism can be pretty hollow and can be really very, very ruthless, which we do see in many parts of the world. So for me, it all feeds in together. But obviously, the arts and culture is incredibly important.
Thank you. And Janet Grainer Hansen from Maryland has a question. Janet, unmute yourself, please.
Okay, hello everyone. I am from Maryland. I've just put a few things in the chat box for your review, but I'm going to start with a question, because thinking about Ireland and thinking about your peace index, and could it be applied to looking back at previous times in Ireland and decades of the war between the North and the South, the Orange and the Green, the Protestant Catholic conflicts. And then when they did decide we've got to have peace and stop bombing each other, and these maybe decade or close to 2 decades of relative peace, could your index look at those 2 times and could make some conclusions, and maybe you write about that in your book? I'm not sure, but sure must be about that.
So I think it's a great question to ponder, Jan. I think it's really good. It's difficult to get the data we need going back in time. So if we go back to Ireland, for example, like this conflict, it's got its origins 400 years ago. I was over in Ireland, and I've got a mate of mine. He'd bought a old retreat for nuns. Okay, and it was 4 centuries old, and we've flown into some city in Ireland, and this guy was a professor of history at Oxford University, so like he knew history inside out and back to front, although he specialised in ancient history. And we're driving up this road and go, oh, this looks like it's an old road. And I was just looking at stuff on the side. He says, yeah, I'll tell you the story. This was built during the potato famines. And what struck me as he moved through this story, how our thoughts on these things haven't changed. We can see it getting played out in the COVID environment currently with international trade. And so what happened is that this perspective, Ireland had quite a diverse, different agriculture, so a variety of plants. Then as the British took over, what they did is they implemented the policy of specialisation right through all their colonies. And so what Ireland did well was really grow great potatoes. So they specialised in 3 types of potatoes. And when 2 of the potatoes got the blight, okay, people didn't have enough food to feed themselves anymore. And so we all know the story. They lost so much of the population, the two potato famines, that the population of Ireland didn't get that to what it was in the 1820s to 2010. That's how bad it was. But we're looking at this, going up this road, he says, well, this was a work for food program, because the British looked at it. And so we've got the story of globalisation, okay, and supply chains, which we can see coming through in COVID now. And you pull this back to systems, which I will in a minute. And so this was a work for food program. So the British didn't want the people to starve, but on the other hand, they didn't want to give them food without having to do something for them, because what they felt is they become lazy and then they wouldn't want to work again. You see it reflected in your dole programs today. But even more strikingly, I've been with World Vision doing projects in the developing world, and they've got work for food programs there. So, okay, we'll do something in the community, and then you'll come and work for us to do it, and we'll give you food as your labour. And so these kind of concepts are almost just getting resurrected back through time. So now if we come back and we look at a concept of a system, this part's profound, okay? So as systems evolve, they become more chaotic, okay? But they've got these things in them called encoded norms, which keep them in check. And if you think about it, there are all sorts of encoded norms in our societies, like the one on inflation is one I mentioned. You can see it in regards criminal justice system, see it in all sorts of ways. And so what happens is it creates more vibration. It's the different parts of the system trying to sort its ways out. But that creates inefficiency within the system. That's one of the things with democracies. They always look a little bit chaotic, don't they? There's always a bit of fighting going on. And we know that a lot of the politics of it in particular create all these inefficiencies. Mm. But those inefficiencies give you the ability to adapt, and a different, if you like, DNA to adapt when things change. So that's the lesson which I can see out of all of this. So it's really sort of, and that's the basis of adaptability. So really, when you're looking at a society, you don't want it to be huge, totally built on efficiency. Because if it's built on efficiency, then it's brittle. It want a big shock in the one weak point, in the one point, and everything else collapses because there's nothing to back it up. It's like the food in Ireland. We can see it reflected in our supply chains globally at the moment, because the cost, they still haven't adjusted after the COVID shock. And there's a lot of things a lot more expensive than what they were. Like the cost of shipping containers is 3 times what it was prior to COVID.
Right.
But if we go back to Ireland, the real issues lie in the politics. They lie in the break between the Protestants and Catholics. Protestants were British. They ruled Ireland. They ended up with the wealth, but the majority of people were still Catholics, and that's the origin of the problem. And correcting those kind of things gets really difficult. We've been doing some work in Northern Ireland with in Belfast actually, and they've got to. So although they've got a peace agreement there at the moment, it's starting to fray around the edges over the last 4 or 5 years. One of the ways they got the peace was to build these incredibly big walls between the different communities. But it's driving through one of the communities with a mate of mine a couple of years ago. And it was just before the big parades. And he says, yeah, well, there's a couple of flags up now, but another few weeks from now, there'll be flags everywhere. And I say, why do they do it? And he says, well, they've got a group of them which are really fanatical, but most of them feel they have to. Otherwise, they're going to get into issues with the radicals for not showing loyalty to their clan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Chick, may I turn to you for your closing remarks or reflections?
Well, my closing remark is to thank you for hosting this, making this possible, and of course to Steve for the incredible contribution you have made to the whole concept, global concept of peace and the value of peace and the ways to get there. Again, I come back to my main point of reason to be optimistic as long as we take advantage of the information and the studies that are taking place and the lessons learned about ways to make the world more peaceful, and a growing recognition that the pathway to a better future for everyone is the pathway of peace. That and as we learn that and embrace it and build it into our body politic and into our economic systems and so on, coming back to Steve and the whole systems concept, I just can't help but be hopeful and optimistic, recognizing the threats that are out there. It could all come unraveled. Things could get worse than ever, but there's every reason to believe that if we pay attention to the lessons that learned, the lessons that Steve shares with us go to the website for the Institute for Economics and Peace, and the amount of information and data that is there is just absolutely overwhelming. If we pay attention to that, and if policymakers will pay attention to that, and the larger public pays attention to it, there is a recognition that it can be done. We can reduce the frequency and severity of violent conflict on this planet dramatically if we have the will. And there's every reason to believe that we're getting closer and closer to having the will. So that's why I continue to do what I can do, even though I'm getting a little bit older and a couple of ailments that get in the way of it. But I just think there's every reason for us to believe in the future and take advantage of the lessons learned and make a difference.
Thank you very much. Steve?
Yeah, well, because the thing I want to drive home, that peace is not a utopian concept. Peace is something which is practical, it's grounded, and the creation of peace also creates many, many other things which we think are important. In fact, without peace, how can societies flourish? But quite often we get caught up in this paradigm of war and peace. But peace is much, much more than just the simple concept of are we in war or are we in peace? Is there a violent criminal in our midst, or is there one not? And we can look within ourselves, and we can look at our own emotionality. And for most of us, other than the rare few, we'll find a mixture of emotions in us. We're neither fully at peace or we're fully in mental anguish or conflict, somewhere in between. And so really, at a personal level, is how do we just slightly decrease our afflictive emotions? If we can do that through our lives, then as an individual, we do become more peaceful. And the same analogy is true for society as well. What are the simple, practical steps we can do to just turn the dial slightly? But it's the continuous turning of that dial over time which makes the profound changes.
Thank you very much, Steve. And with heartfelt thanks and gratitude, I'll conclude with a quote from your book, Winning War and Winning Peace. We have tried, the human race has tried many times in many costly adventures to win the war. It doesn't seem to work. So I hope your ongoing efforts and those of Chick and many others in the nonprofit research community are going to lead to winning the peace. So thank you very much, everyone. Looking forward to reuniting at the Rumi Forum concert in September. Check out for details, which will be announced soon. And stay well till then.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.